Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to Preparing for the Entry-Level Driver Training Regulations and Training Provider Registry. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If you should require assistance during the call, please press star, then 0. I would now like to turn the conference over to our host, Rachel Dickerson. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dawn. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Preparing for the Entry-Level Driver Training Regulations and Training Provider Registry. Today's session is being hosted by the FMCSA National Training Center. My name is Rachel Dickerson, and I will be your host for today. A copy of the presentation and handout was sent out about an hour ago to all registrants. If you did not see that email, the presentation will be available for download throughout the webinar. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If you have a question, you can type it in to the Q&A pod. We are not taking any questions over the phone today. Today's session is being recorded. Just a quick side note, for those who may experience any technical issues, you see a black screen, or if the presentation has frozen, please exit the webinar room and then come back in and join us. Also, if you are experiencing any more issues, please make sure that you are logged on using Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, or try disconnecting from your VPN. Now, I would like to turn things over to your moderator for today, Lisa Hacker. Take it away, Lisa.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel. And hello, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is designed to help providers of entry-level driver training understand the requirements that they need to meet to be eligible to register with FMCSA. We will also recommend some steps that training providers can take today to begin preparing for registration, which will open this summer. As Rachel mentioned, we are recording today's session, and the recording will be available via email, and we will also be posting it on the Training Provider Registry website after this webinar wraps up. Before we get started, Rachel also noted that everyone is in listen-only mode. Just want to remind people that that Q&A pod is there on the left side of the screen. At any point during today's webinar, please feel free to enter your questions into that pod. We will be pausing to answer some questions during the webinar, and some questions we'll also be responding to directly. So hopefully we'll be trying to get to as many questions as we can throughout today's webinar. So first, let's meet our panelists. Today we'll hear from Joshua Jones from FMCSA's Commercial Driver's License Division, and we'll also hear from Andrew Nagel, who's a member of the Training Provider Registry Development Team. And just a quick sneak peek at what we'll cover today. First, we'll talk about the ELDT final rule, what that is and who it applies to. Then we'll talk about the Training Provider Registry, which you'll hear mentioned a lot today. Once it's operational, how CDL applicants, training providers, and states will use the registry. We'll also, as we said, talk about those requirements that training providers will need to meet per the ELDT regulations. And we'll talk about preparing for that important milestone date, February 7th, 2022. We'll talk about things training providers can do before, during, and after their registration to help prepare for that date. The last thing we'll talk about today is connecting to the TPR web service. Just want to emphasize that that information is only for training providers who are planning on setting up an interface between their IT systems and FMCSA's Training Provider Registry via that TPR web service. If your training provider is planning to just log into the system and enter information manually, that information is not pertinent to you, and we'll let you know when we get to that part of the webinar so that you can be sure to log off if that's not relevant to you. All right, and at this point, I'll turn things over to Josh to get us started talking about the ELDT final rule.
Thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We've got a lot to cover in today's meeting, and so I'll start with a brief high-level overview of the ELDT regulations and the Training Provider Registry, though we expect many of you already are familiar with this information. Okay, so the ELDT rule was congressionally mandated by MAP 21, the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, and published in late 2016. The rule was later amended for the B to A upgrade, and then the extension with the compliance date. The rule established the minimum training requirements that entry-level drivers and training providers must meet. I'll note that states may have requirements that exceed federal requirements. So, for example, a state could require a minimum number of hours for, say, the behind-the-wheel portion. Also note the compliance date for ELDT is February 7th, 2022, so we're less than a year out from that date. And the rule established the need for the training provider registry, which supports the ELDT program and makes enforcement of the regulations possible. Training providers must meet applicable state and federal regulations and be listed on the training provider registry in order to provide ELDT. And we'll get into that more a bit later. Okay, so as mentioned, the ELDT regulations establish federal minimum training requirements for entry-level drivers. So who is considered an entry-level driver? These standards are applicable to individuals applying for a Class A or B CDL for the first time, applying for an upgrade of their existing Class B CDL to a Class A CDL, or applying for a hazardous materials passenger or school bus endorsement for the first time. These individuals are subject to the ELDT regulations and requirements and must complete a prescribed program of instruction provided by an entity that is listed on FMCSA's Training Provider Registry, the TPR. There are some exceptions, of course, so I'll mention that individuals who obtain a CLP before February 7th, 2022 are not required to meet the ELDT regulations for obtaining a CDL so long as they obtain a CDL prior to their CLP or their renewed CLP expires. And keep in mind that while today's webinar is designed to give you an overview of the federal ELDT regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations is the official source of this information. As such, you can access an electronic version of the Code of Federal Regulations online at www.ecfr.gov, and I encourage you to bookmark that website. And if you're not familiar with the CFR, it's divided into titles, parts, and then sections. In today's presentation, you'll see references to the CFR regulations such as 49 CFR 383, highlighted in yellow at the bottom of this slide, which 49 refers to the title and 383 refers to the part. Title 49 addresses transportation, so all of our references will fall under Title 49. You can use this reference or these references to link to specific sections of the regulations easily and find the detailed information you need. Okay, so I've mentioned it a couple times already, but let's talk about the Training Provider Registry. The Training Provider Registry, or the TPR, will be an FMCSA web system that contains a list of providers eligible to provide ELDT. It will also retain a record of the drivers that have successfully completed entry-level driver training. So it'll be the repository of all that information. And moving forward, I'm going to provide this quick overview of how driver training certification gets to the TPR and what happens to it. So first we have drivers will use the TPR website to search for a training provider. They will work with the training provider or training providers to complete the required ELDT training. And then once the driver has successfully completed the ELDT required training, the training provider would then electronically submit that information to the TPR and certify the driver has met the requirements. This must be done for each student that completes the course. FMCSA will then retain this driver training certification information in the TPR, and then before a CDL applicant subject to ELDT regulations takes a relevant skills or knowledge test, the SDLA or skills examiner will use their state's IT system to retrieve the driver's data from the training provider registry, and then they'll verify that the applicant meets the federal minimum requirements. And because the information is coming from the training provider registry, and only registered training providers can submit driver data into the system, this retrieval confirms that the driver completed their training with a registered provider. All right, so now we're going to talk through what the ELDT regulations require of entry-level driver training providers. So when you register on the training provider registry, you'll have to certify that you comply with all federal requirements and applicable state requirements in the states where you plan to provide training. We'll quickly go through the requirements related to each of the categories you see on this slide now. So first up, sorry, my slide is a little slow here. First up, we have registering with FMCSA. To be authorized to provide entry-level driver training, training providers must register with FMCSA. During this registration, training providers must self-certify that they meet all federal requirements and those applicable state requirements. Only registered training providers will be listed on the TPR website, which we plan to make publicly viewable in later this year in late 2021. And only registered training providers will be able to submit driver training certification information to FMCSA. Training providers are required to register even if they do not provide training to the general public. So for those that may want to, providers may omit their contact information from the public. Let's talk about curricula now. So training providers must cover all topics described in 49 CFR Part 380, Appendices A through E as applicable. There is no required minimum number of instruction hours, but all applicable topics must be covered. Separate training providers may deliver the theory and behind the wheel portions or the BTW portions of the training, but both portions, the range and public road portions of the behind the wheel training must be delivered by the same training provider. Driver trainees must complete both theory and behind the wheel portions of training within 1 year of each other, except of course for individuals seeking the H or hazardous materials endorsement. Also note real quick that a simulation device cannot be used for behind the wheel instruction, but can be used for theory instruction. And in the very near future, we're going to have a curricula summary document available for download that will provide an overview of these requirements. We think that it'll be a useful tool for you all to use and refer to when it comes to the curricular requirements. Moving forward on to instructors. For instructors, 2 years is the magic number to remember. Instructors must hold a CDL of the same or higher class with all the necessary endorsements for the type of training provided, and must have at least either 2 years experience driving the type of CMV for which driving is being provided or the training is being provided, or at least 2 years experience as a behind the wheel CMV instructor. It's important to note that if a license is canceled, suspended, or revoked due to offenses listed or identified in 38351, the instructor cannot provide training until at least 2 years have passed since that CDL was reinstated. So moving forward, we're going to touch base on facilities. Training providers must self-certify that they meet applicable federal, state, and/or local statutes and regulations pertaining to classroom and range facilities. Note that FMCSA doesn't have any specific facility requirements, but the Department of Labor or OSHA and like the Department of Education as well as other agencies may regulate facility requirements. So training providers are responsible for knowing and complying with those applicable regulations. As for the range, though, it means an area that is free of obstructions and has adequate sight lines. It enables the driver to maneuver safely and free from interference from other vehicles and hazards. Moving on to vehicles, training providers must also self-certify that vehicles used for training comply with applicable federal and state safety requirements. For FMCSA vehicle requirements, those can be found in parts 392, 393, and 396. Also, vehicles must be in the same group and type that the driver trainees intend to operate for their CDL skills test. Okay, on to state licensing. Training providers must be licensed, certified, registered, or authorized by the state where the training is conducted as applicable. I'll note that some states may not have requirements for entry-level driver training providers, but you'll need to confirm that with states where the training is conducted. And also note that state licensing requirements do not apply to providers that are only providing theory training online, so only online theory training. Okay, so assessments. First, we have theory training assessments. Training providers must use assessments, either written or electronic format, to determine trainees' proficiency with all units in the theory curriculum. Students must earn a minimum overall score of 80%. And so for behind the wheel training, training instructors must evaluate and document a trainee's proficiency in behind the wheel skills. Training instructors must document the total number of clock hours each trainee spends to complete the BTW or behind the wheel curriculum. But again, there's no minimum number of hours required. We just ask, or you're just required to provide that total number of clock hours. All right, so driver training certification. The ELDT regulations require that training providers submit information to certify drivers have completed a training course that meets ELDT standards by midnight of the second business day after each student completes a training course. This information will include driver trainee name, their date of birth, license or permit number, and the state of issuance. It'll also include the CDL class and or endorsement and type, as well as the specifics about the type of training completed, for example, the theory or the BTW behind the wheel. Also included would be the score on written theory assessments, if applicable, as well as the total number of clock hours spent for behind the wheel training, if applicable. And then, of course, the date of successful completion of training. I'll note that also, you do not need to submit driver training certification information before February 7th, 2022, the ELDT compliance date. As you know, FMCSA is still developing the training provider registry, and while you'll be able to register and be listed on the TPR later this year, you won't be required to submit that driver training certification until February 7, 2022. Also mention that you'll be able to submit driver training information by filling out a form on the registry for each driver or by building a connection from your IT system to the registry, but we'll discuss that a little later in the webinar. All right, so documentation and record retention. Training providers must retain specific records, including the self-certification, certifications by accepted driver trainees for behind-the-wheel training, attesting that they will comply with U.S. DOT Department of Transportation regulations, as well as state and or local laws related to the controlled substances and alcohol testing, age, medical certification, licensing, and driving records. A copy of the trainee's CLP or CDL is required. Instructor qualification documentation, lesson plans for theory and behind-the-wheel range and public road training curricula, and records of individual entry-level driver training assessments. These records must be maintained for at least 3 years from the date each required record is generated or received, unless a record such as behind-the-wheel instructor CDL has expired or been canceled, in which case the most recent valid CDL would be retained or should be retained. Also, these provisions do not affect a training provider's obligation to comply with any other local, state, or federal requirements prescribing longer retention periods for any category of records described. So very important to note there, in case there's other regulations, you'll need to be aware of those. Moving forward to FMCSA audits, training providers must allow FMCSA or its authorized representative to audit their operations. If FMCSA determines that a training provider does not meet all applicable requirements, FMCSA may remove the training provider from the registry. Any training conducted after a training provider's removal date will be considered invalid. Training providers who wish to remain listed on the registry may appeal FMCSA's decision or take corrective action. And for more information on these audits and involuntary removal, see 380.721 or 380.723 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And for maintaining registration, for continued listing on the registry, you must keep your information up to date. This means updating any information within 30 days of the change and updating your listing every other year, even if nothing has changed. And to touch base on changes, this includes information such as name, address, or phone number, the types of training offered, training provider status, and change in state licensure or certifications or accreditation statuses. Okay, so now for February 7th, 2022, ELDT compliance. I'm just going to provide a quick reminder of some of the key dates for implementation of the training provider registry. This summer, training providers can begin the registration process so that your listing is current in the fall when the public search feature of the registry begins, and prospective students may be looking for authorized entry-level driver training providers. Again, but you don't need to submit driver certification information to the TPR until that February 7th, 2022 compliance date. So those are the key dates for this. So definitely be aware of the summer 2021 and fall 2021 dates, as well as that compliance date. Okay, so are you prepared? There's a lot of things that you can do now to ensure that you are ready when TPR registration opens this summer. First, you want to review your curricula, your vehicles, your documentation and processes to make sure you meet ELDT requirements that we just walked through. When you're registering to be listed on the TPR, that's when you're going to self-certify, and you must self-certify that you meet all ELDT requirements. And while you are not required to register with FMCSA until February 7th, 2022 compliance date, registering early, though, means that your information will be available to drivers who start searching for training providers when the public search opens this fall. And just as a reminder, for a complete list of training provider requirements, be sure to check out 49 CFR Part 380 subparts F and G and those appendices A through E, which I believe are hyperlinked in the slide. So download the slides, it'll take you right there. Continuing on in Are You Prepared? So another thing that you want to be thinking about now is how you will submit driver training records to the training provider registry. While most training providers will manually submit records by logging into the registry and submitting each driver's information into an online form, some training providers may submit data using an automated web service. To use this second option, you'll have to have, or you're going to have to build a connection from your IT system, either existing or if you plan to build one, to the registry. And note, again, FMCSA may begin accepting that training provider certification record slightly before the compliance date, but we'll have an update late in 2021 if we decide to start doing that prior to the compliance date, but again, you're not required to. And to add on a bit more to the previous information about web services, building a connection to the training provider registry to submit driver training information is not for everyone. So here are some things that you may want to consider when deciding if web service submissions, if that option is right for you. So do you anticipate submitting a significant number of driver training certifications on a regular basis? That's something you want to consider, but we realize that a significant number is subjective. So you should take a look at your own business needs and determine if you would see a return on the investment. Do you already have an existing IT system in which you track driver training results? This is a requirement of using the TPR web service interface. So if you do not, manual entry is likely the best solution for you. Also, if you have your own IT system, do you have an IT support team that can make the necessary updates to your IT system and maintain your system so that it continue operating? If not, again, you will likely want to opt for the manual option, but another thing you'll want to consider. All right, and so to make use, best make use of everyone's time, we're going to pause here. It's been a ton of information to answer questions that have been coming in via the Q&A pod. So, please take a moment now to enter any questions you have, but we'll begin that part. So I'll turn that over to Lisa to help me out with that.
Sure, thanks Josh. And we have had a number of questions coming in. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can, knowing that we do still have a little bit of content to get through before 4 o'clock. But first we'll look at some questions about the registration process. A few questions came in kind of similar to each other about training providers that maybe only train a specific group of people, so they don't necessarily want to be contacted by drivers looking for training. So some examples were government agencies, employer trainers, school districts, and they're asking if they're still required to register in the training provider registry. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So essentially, yes, you would still have to be registered on the TPR in order to provide ELDT, or entry-level driver training. I will note that, essentially we're going to have a list of public training providers and those who aren't available to just anyone or available to the general public, which could be, those government agencies or those who are doing that type of in-house training that isn't necessarily available to just anyone outside the agency.
Great, thank you. Another question about registration. If someone, as an example, registers as a Class B trainer, can they change their registration later to list that they're a Class A trainer?
Yeah, and just to ensure, so it basically update the training that's being
Correct.
offered. Is that correct? Yeah, exactly. Training provider will have the ability to do that in the training provider registry.
Okay, great. Then there's a question about, as a union trainer, we have members in various states. Do I, as an instructor, need to register in each state? So I think there might be two questions kind of baked into that. One is registering in each state, and then also, can you clarify if instructors need to register in the registry?
So essentially, you'll have to register on the training provider registry, and then you'll have your location listed on the registry as well. So if you're registered in, say, one state, and that's where your locations are, you'll need to meet those applicable state requirements. But if you have more than, more locations in other states, you'll have to also meet those state requirements for that specific location.
Great, thank you.
And that second part, can you re-ask it? Yeah.
Sure. The question was about whether they had to register as an instructor. They need to register. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about what we mean when we say a training provider must register, because I believe individual instructors, there's not a requirement to register. Is that right?
Right. So a training provider, it could be an entity or an individual, but yeah. So the way it would work is if you have an organization, or if you're registering as an organization, you would be able to have under that umbrella your training providers listed, and you could list them that way, but they don't have to individually register outside of your organization. I hope that made sense.
Okay, and if not, if you still have if that was your question, you still need some clarification about that, please feel free to enter another question in the Q&A pod. The last question we have on registration before we move on is about the self-certification. They're asking how they would do that as a training provider. So kind of can we give them a picture of what that self-certification might look like, or what they might have to do?
So yeah, the self-certification is ultimately, you attesting and certifying that you meet all applicable requirements that we went through, including the curricula, the vehicle pieces, and range and classroom facilities. So it's essentially you're attesting and under perjury of law, basically, that you meet all of the applicable requirements to provide ELDT training.
Great, thank you. We had several questions come in about the submission of driver certification information. So I'm going to move over to that topic. First question is, will there be training available on that process, on submitting the driver information?
On how to submit the information?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, we plan to provide more education and outreach materials as we progress in the implementation of the training provider registry. So we'll be able to provide either like an overview of it or a how-to, but certainly there will be education materials that you could refer to on how that will be done.
Great, thank you. There's a question about lesson plans. They're asking if the lesson plans need to be submitted for each individual trainee, or if they need to submit general lesson plans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite understand the full question about submitting lesson plans. but training providers, they'll have to have a copy, and they need to retain basically what their curriculum is, but it's not necessarily required to be submitted. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but that wouldn't be
No, I think
submitted to the TPR.
Yeah, I think that's a good clarification. Again, feel free to enter another question if you still need information about that. But yeah, I think maybe clarifying what information does and does not get submitted as part of that driver certification information is helpful.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, the submission piece of that is strictly the driver information, and as well as those the score for the theory, the total number of clock hours for behind the wheel, the class, the endorsements, and the specifics about the type of training completed. But yeah, again, that's for the training certification information that a person completes.
Okay. One question, will there be a fee to use the manual submission process?
No fees required.
Great. All right. I think we're going to move quickly to answer just a couple more questions before we move to our last section of the webinar. A few questions came in about assessments. One question, or a few questions about this. Other than the 80% passing requirement, are there any other details about the exam, the theory exam, or is there a standardized test form that FMCSA makes available, or any information about those details that training providers need to know?
So no, there isn't an FMCSA format for that theory assessment. That's for training providers to come up with. Again, we don't have any sort of example of that at this time.
Okay.
Was there another part of that question, Lisa?
I don't think so. I think that covered it.
Okay.
A couple people were wondering if there was a sample or if there was a standardized test, and it sounds like the answer is no, that's something the training providers develop.
Right, and yeah,
right?
again, it's just, and it has to, the curriculum and the assessment has to cover the theory curriculum in total.
Right. So as long as it meets the requirements set out in the criteria and the regulations.
Correct.
Okay. And a question, and I believe this was covered, but just to confirm, can the assessment scores on the written training be pass-fail, or does it require a grade or percentage?
For the written theory, we do require that 80% mark.
Great, thank you. A lot of good questions come in, just trying to make sure we get to as many as we can. Several questions did come in about the question about the training that drivers are required to take, So for example, a few people asked about a scenario where a driver has a Class C CDL, but it also has, for example, a passenger and a school bus endorsement. Would they need to go through all of the ELD training if they wanted to upgrade to a B license, for example?
And you said Class C as in Charlie?
Yes.
Yeah, so if they were seeking a Class B CDL, yes, they would be required to complete all applicable Class B ELDT or entry-level driver training.
Okay, and if they have, I think some of the questions are also getting at if they have a Class C with one of the P, S, or H endorsements, and they're hoping to get a Class B with those endorsements, are they required to take the training for the endorsements, or do the pre-existing endorsements kind of make them not subject?
Yeah, the pre-existing endorsements essentially grandfather them in and wouldn't be subject to ELDT.
Okay, great. I think that answers a few of those questions. So hopefully some folks got the information they need. I know there's a lot of information, there are a lot of questions still to cover, but I think we need to move on to the last portion on the TPR web service. I think we're going to cover that as briefly as we can and then open up for some more Q&A. So I think we're going to recommend that people stick around if they haven't had their question answered, just in case we have an opportunity to answer that at the end. But for now, I will turn things over to Andrew Nagel. Oh, and one thing before we do that, want to make sure, in case we lose anyone before this section, there are more resources available. Some of them do cover some of the questions that came in today. So if you haven't done so already, please make sure to visit the Training Provider Registry website, especially the new landing page that we have created specifically for training providers. That is as recent as last week. So if you haven't seen it yet, please do make sure you take a look at that page. And there's also some great information for developers who are interested in the option that we are about to discuss. So Andrew, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process that you go through to submit data via the Training Provider web service. We did have a webinar that talked through some of the early information we had available about this service that is available on the Training Provider website for the Developer Toolkit area. If you want to take a look at that, that goes into a little more detail than we'll cover today. Also, kind of step back a second just to talk about when would this service really be useful? I know Josh went through that a little bit in his part of the presentation. And the key things that we thought, if you already have an IT system, this could be a good fit. If you're storing your training records, in file folders, and then you basically have to type them into a computer to get them into the point where you could submit them via a web service, you might as well just type them directly into the Training Provider Registry website. There's no reason to kind of build your own intermediary. But if you're already storing your records in an IT system and you've got a lot of them and you anticipate having to perform a lot of data entry into the Training Provider website, it may make sense to invest the time and effort up front to build an interface between your existing IT system and the Training Provider Registry web service. So in general, the process of connecting to that web service is going to be kind of connecting and submitting data. It's really going to be a three-step process. There's the authentication piece. For that, we're using JWT as the technology. So that's a token that you will generate based on the credentials we issue to you. You'll send that along with your request, and that'll tell us who you are and what what provider you're submitting data on behalf of. You're going to send that with your submission. That's a JSON-based submission that's going to a REST service. That's going to contain all the information about a specific single training provider record. And then we're going to give you a response that's either going to say, yep, we've got your data, everything looks good, and we're going to create the record for you, and here's kind of an ID for you that you can use to look up that record later. Or there's some problem with what you submitted us. Either it doesn't meet some of the logic requirements, or maybe you didn't authenticate correctly, or you're using the wrong token. Maybe you've got you're working with multiple providers, and you've sent us a token for the wrong provider who doesn't have access to the locations that you're submitting data on. We'll send that in a response to allow you to kind of debug the process. I would definitely recommend taking a look at the training provider website for a lot more of the details on the kind of specifics of this process, what the format of the JSON object is, what the different methods will be. But today, I'm really interested in talking about the new stuff that we've made available on the website within the last couple of months, which allows you to connect to the site and begin testing things. So to kind of help you in the process of building out the web service connections, we've made a test version of the service available now. So that service is available now, and you can submit data to it anytime. So we've made the service available, and information about connecting to it is in the Developer Toolkit. If you went there previously, there was information that talked about what would be coming soon. Now a lot of that coming soon stuff is there. So definitely go and check out again. There's a new version of the Developer Tool, of the Developer Guide, which does have some edits to it, some kind of edits and some technical edits, but primarily the biggest thing is that we've included information on how to use that test service. In addition, we posted to that Developer Toolkit some example credentials that you can use today if you want to connect to that service and submit data to it. I mean, it's not actually going to get written to the training provider registry, but we perform all the same validation on that submitted data that we would do once the registry goes live. So you're able to test out and make sure that everything you're submitting is valid and accurate, and then we're going to accept that data down the road. Eventually, as we move forward the process and training providers can start registering, we'll provide mechanisms to issue credentials that are specific to you, so you can begin testing with those in the future. Kind of some other things to just cover a little bit. I saw some questions come in earlier. We are not currently planning on offering a bulk upload type option. Really, the two options we're offering, as Josh said, would be entering data via the web interface or using the web service. The nature of the provider data entry, it doesn't work as simply for a bulk upload, just because you potentially have multiple types of training that can be uploaded at a time. So web service was the kind of automated process that we decided to go with for the training provider registry at launch time. So those are going to be your two options that we've made available. And that's all I've got. And I think we're going to jump back over and see if there are any questions, any specific questions that people have.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. We have not had a lot of questions come in specifically about the TPR web service. It looks like we have one asking, what is an example of an existing IT system used for tracking driver training results?
I don't have a good example of, sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't have a good example of a specific system, but if you're storing your driver training data in a computer, then you've got an IT system. Now, maybe that's just an Excel file, in which case, that probably isn't going to be a great fit. But if that's a whole web-based interface or something where we're storing it into a database, that may be the situation where it makes sense to invest the time up front to build an interface between that system and the training provider registry.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think those are all the questions specific to the TPR web service, but we still have plenty of questions and to answer in the time we have left. So Josh, I think some of these are going to be coming back to you. One thing somebody asked us to clarify a previous statement. The statement was made, some states do not have requirements for entry-level driver training providers. They're asking, does that statement mean that not all states are required to register in the training provider registry? And if not, what did we mean by that statement?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. No, it wasn't meant to say that the states wouldn't be required or training providers wouldn't be required to register in the training provider registry. It's just was meant that, some states have certain oversight or regulations that training providers must follow, while some states might not have those. And so, it wasn't meant to say that, there would be an option to not register.
Great, thank you. I think that was a good clarification. Another question came in. If a training provider trains drivers in one state, the example they're giving is Kentucky, will they also be able to train drivers with CDLs in other states?
One more time?
So if they train drivers in, for example, Kentucky, will the training provider also be able to train drivers in other states?
Gotcha. The training provider would they'd be registered on the TPR, and if their location is based in Kentucky, that's where they would be providing their training. If the training provider wants to also register in other states, they would have to register those locations under the training provider entity on the TPR. I believe that answers the question.
Great, thank you. A few more questions. Do the students have to finish one part before they can start the next? Such as, must they finish theory before starting range, or can they take them kind of concurrently?
There is no requirement on that. So from our understanding, it does sound like training providers sort of intermingle those the theory and the behind the wheels, which is perfectly fine. An applicant does not have to do theory and complete it prior to advancing to behind the wheel.
Thank you. A few different questions have come in about the, there are certain requirements training providers need to meet, whether that's the time requirement, submitting by the second business day at midnight, or whether that's meeting the curricular requirements, what have you. They're asking what will happen if FMCSA determines that a training provider does not meet any of these requirements?
Right. So what could happen is FMCSA may remove the training provider from the training provider registry. Of course, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, training providers would have the option to appeal that decision, or maybe come up with a corrective action to correct those deficiencies. But ultimately, yeah, it could lead to a removal of the training provider from the registry.
Great, thank you. A few questions have come in around the slide where we discussed instructor qualification documentation. Some people, it seems, are wondering what qualifies a person to be an instructor, and also what are the requirements around retaining that documentation? Can it be paper versus electronic, that kind of thing?
Right. So to answer that second part real quick, it could be paper or it can be electronic. For that other part, there's the theory instructor or the behind the wheel instructor is defined in the regulations. So, for example, theory instructor means an individual who provides knowledge instruction on the operation of CMV and meets the qualifications. And the qualifications would be holding a CDL of the same or higher class and with the applicable or with all endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which training is to be provided, and have at least 2 years of experience driving a CMV requiring a CDL of that same or higher class and the same or the same endorsements. And of course, they would have to meet applicable state qualification requirements for CMV instructors. Or, again, for the theory instructor, it would also be a person holding a CDL of the same or higher class and with the endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which the training is provided and has at least 2 years of experience as a BTW CMV instructor and meets all the applicable state requirements for CMV instructors. So again, they are defined in Part 380 of 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and certainly the information you could refer back to in the slide if it's helpful as well, that you can download.
Great, thank you so much. One question is about if a driver uses 2 different training providers for different portions of their training, the question is who uploads the certificate, or I suppose who submits electronically the information to the training provider registry?
So Lisa, again, that was a question that if there's 2 providers, 2 different providers
Correct.
providing theory and then the behind the wheel.
Yes, that would be an example, yeah.
Right. So yeah, in an example where one training provider provides theory and it's from a separate entity than who is providing the behind the wheel, that theory training provider would be required to upload the information, and then the behind the wheel training provider would also submit an ELDT certification. So both of those records would be required to be submitted to the TPR.
Great. So it sounds like the training provider would certify the training that the driver completed with that training provider, only that portion?
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's great. We have about 3 minutes left. One question that came in, I think is a quick answer. Are we saying that before any training can start, that the driver must have their CLP?
No, that's not necessarily true. You know, a person could begin their training for theory without a CLP. But in order to do the behind the wheel public range, they would be required to have that CLP in order to operate that CMD.
Okay, great. We got a clarification on one of the questions we answered earlier. This scenario is if somebody is applying just for a CDL Class C with a P endorsement. So they're not applying for a B or an A, but they are applying for the Class C with that P endorsement. Are they subject to ELDT?
Yeah, so if a person would be considered an entry-level driver and subject to ELDT if they're applying for a passenger endorsement for the first time. So if they don't have that passenger endorsement and never have, then they would be subject to ELDT.
Okay, great. I think that is all that we have time for today. We tried to get through as many questions as we could, but there are a lot of great questions that came in. So one thing we want to make sure we do is share our contact information. If you have a question that you did not hear addressed today, please make sure to get in touch with us. Again, you can visit the Training Provider Registry website. One thing that you can do there also, if you haven't done so already, is to sign up for email updates. That way, whenever we make the downloads that we referred to today that are coming soon, when those are available, you'll find out as soon as they're posted when we send that email update. Any other enhancements we make to the site, any other information we send out. If you want to make sure you're getting that information, please make sure you're signed up for those email updates. Also on the Training Provider Registry website, there is a link for contacting us. That will pop up a window where you can enter in your information and your question to us. That will go directly to the TPR team. We'll answer those as quickly as we can. We answer all the questions that come into that. So that is another great way to get your questions answered as well. Josh, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we close up for today?
I just want to say thank you all for joining us today, and lots of great questions. And as Lisa mentioned, if there's a question that was not answered, definitely reach out to us, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And other than that, I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.